Welcome to Politics Plus, conversations about American politics, economics, history, and culture. I'm your host, Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is Mona Charen, one of the most prominent conservative voices in the United States. She writes a syndicated column that appears in more than 200 newspapers, is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and is the author of the books Useful Idiots, Do-Gooders, and the recently released Sex Matters: How Modern Feminism Lost Touch with Science, Love, and Common Sense. Mona Charen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, you open the book with a sort of a very bold sentence: feminism has triumphed. And immediately I'm thinking, well, I bet you there are plenty of people who would say, in a society where women still earn considerably less than men do, where women make up only around 20% of Congress and about 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs, and where sexual harassment is still endemic in many workplaces, that feminism hasn't even come close to triumphing. So I'm wondering what your response to that would be.
Sure. Well, in Sex Matters, I address all of those issues. Let's start with the fact that there are fewer than 20% of women in Congress and 5% in the Fortune 500 CEOs. I talk about this a lot in my chapter called Having It All, where I say, look, you have to take into account that women make free choices, that they know exactly what they're doing, and when they choose not to, say, run for office or go for that higher paying job or get on the track to be the CEO, it's because they're balancing their professional and their personal lives. And for most women, spending a significant amount of their childbearing years with their children is a high priority. And there are only 24 hours in a day, and many, many women, the majority, based on the data that I've collected in Sex Matters, the majority make those trade-offs willingly. They understand that when they spend more time with their children, they're going to have less of an opportunity to be the CEO. But in terms of the pay gap between men and women, there's broad agreement now in the literature that this is the consequence of women cutting back on their work hours and when their children come along. So if you look at and compare young men and young women at the same education levels and so forth, and skills, at the beginnings of their careers, you find there's no pay gap. It only begins to appear when women start to cut back when they have children. And that is kind of a natural thing. It doesn't mean that it's discrimination. It just means people are making free choices.
So in a sense, it's not necessarily to say that there isn't discrimination, but what you're arguing is that we need to be more careful about how we parse this data and what we look at.
Sure. Look, is there still discrimination against women? Sure. Is there still sexism in the world? Of course there is. But it's a matter of balance and recognizing that not all of the disparities that we see are attributable to those factors. They're also attributable to people making decisions about how they want their lives to unfold.
Right. Maybe it would be, I guess, helpful to talk a little bit about what we mean by feminism, because your book is all about sort of the wrong path that you would argue that modern feminism has taken. And for me, what I think about feminism is supporting equal rights, supporting opportunities for women. And by that definition, I consider myself a feminist. So I'm wondering how that fits with your definition of feminism.
Right. So by your definition of feminism, I'm a feminist too. I believe in the full moral, philosophical, political, and every other kind of equality between the sexes. What I don't believe is that the sexes are identical and that there are no important differences. That it tends to be and has been over the last several decades one of the tenets of feminism that has alienated me. I don't buy that there are no differences except those that are socially constructed. I think there are some basic biological differences that have a huge impact on our lives, our choices, our needs, and our desires. And I also would stress that feminism took two serious wrong turns back in the 1970s that, again, were not just about the political and social and economic equality of women, but were something else. One was their total embrace of abortion as a feminist value, which many of us are offended by, and we think that it undermines one of the most important values and morals of human life, that is the attachment between mothers and babies. And those of us who are pro-life are offended that feminism made abortion such a key feature of their philosophy. And the other was the embrace of the sexual revolution, to go hand in hand, of course, to some extent. But I don't think that you needed to endorse, destroying the traditional nuclear family, destroying all of the guideposts and rules about sexual behavior that were part of the sexual revolution in order to advance women's interests. In fact, I would argue, embracing the sexual revolution turned out to be a very bad deal for women.
Yeah,
so those are the things.
Yeah, I definitely want to ask you a few more things about that. But before we do, I also wanted to point out that you make what I think is a really important distinction early on in the book when you talk about the difference between, I guess you could say, more old school feminism, which dates back hundreds of years, and isn't it called second wave? The second wave feminists of the 60s and 70s. And this is what you mean by modern feminism, right? The second wave.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
The feminism that I'm criticizing is from the 60s and 70s and since. The old-fashioned feminism that I praise is the first wave, usually called the suffragists and other campaigners for human rights of women. That you could cite Mary Wollstonecraft or John Stuart Mill, many others. And I'm certainly with them. Women are the full equals of men in intellect, in rights, and of course in spirit, in a spiritual sense.
In the book, I seem to recall there's a phrase that sticks in my mind. I think it's from you, where you write that equality doesn't mean sameness, and I'm wondering if that's one of the big distinctions between the first wave of feminists and the second wave.
Yeah, it really is. The first wave feminists were fine with recognizing that men and women were different. Because they understood that you don't have to be identical to have full human rights. I mean, that's not necessary. You don't have to make that leap. And in fact, I actually argue that feminists, again, they made mistakes in terms of trying to make women into men, trying to say that women were just like men because they were, eager to have all of the rights of men as they saw it and all of the privileges. And so they thought they needed to frame it as we're just alike, but we're not. Men are more aggressive. They have a lot stronger sex drive. They're more promiscuous by nature than women, I would argue. And these are all important differences that people have to be honest about. And I also think people don't need to be afraid of them. We don't need to be afraid to acknowledge that there are differences because out of fear that people will then say that one is inferior and the other is superior. We're not inferior or superior. We're just different.
Right. So, I mean, and in the book, you devote a lot of time to looking at the scientific research on these differences. And so I guess what I was wondering is there any sort of common reaction to when modern feminists see this? I mean, do they deny this research? It just seems to me to be difficult to deny a lot of these pretty straightforward, it seems to me, biological differences.
So a number of the women that I quote in the book, a number of the scientists that I quote in the book about the science of sex differences are women scientists. So I'm sure that many of them, if you ask, would say, sure, they think of themselves as feminists. Maybe, I would suspect, maybe they think of themselves as the old-fashioned kind of feminist who believes in equal rights and equal treatment. but they would not deny. In fact, they are in the business of proving that there are important differences between the sexes. But you ask, does anybody deny it? Yeah, I'm afraid a lot of people deny it. A lot of feminists deny these differences or minimize them or say they're utterly trivial. And I argue in this book, Sex Matters, that they're not that trivial. They're actually somewhat significant. And even still, we shouldn't worry that if we acknowledge them, that somehow women are going to be viewed as inferior. I think in some ways women are superior to men. You know, they're a lot more law-abiding, less violent, more attached. You know, they tend to live longer. They've got all kinds of advantages.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But that doesn't mean, right, you're not making an argument that societal norms, societal pressures don't play a role on their own. It seems to me you're just suggesting that at least some modern feminists are undervaluing the role of the biological and overvaluing the role of societal pressures and that sort of thing.
Well, that's it. I mean, you have it exactly right. Look, of course, culture matters. Culture matters tremendously. That's why, you know, people in Tibet behave differently from people in New Orleans. Of course. But there are certain universals that you find in behavior between the sexes that are global. And when you see traits, for example, that show up everywhere around the world, in every culture, in every time that we know about, for example, that men tend to be more promiscuous sexually than women, and women tend to be more oriented toward longer-term relationships and monogamy. When you find that universally, you begin to think, you know, maybe it isn't cultural, maybe it's sort of inbred. Similarly, when you see traits that show up in the first days of infancy, the first days of life, and these are consistent across time and culture. For example, that little baby girls, infant girls, will be more responsive to the sound of a human voice than infant boys. That they seem to prefer, from very young ages, different kinds of toys, that they have different sensitivity to light and sound. If these things show up so early, it's hard to argue that they are culturally constructed.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if part of the issue or part of the problem is that when modern feminism was being born, that the state of the research on this wasn't nearly as good. And we've learned so much with evolutionary psychology and biology and that sort of thing, that just the people who started this really just haven't been able to reform their views in light of new evidence, which of course is always difficult for human beings to do.
It is hard. I agree, but that's one of the reasons I wrote Sex Matters, so that people can take a new look, a fresh look, and say, you know, some of these ideas have really been supplanted by science. You know, there's a prejudice that some people have that says, you know, that some Republicans, for example, and conservatives are anti-science because they engage in denial about climate change, and I would say that that's right. Some people are resistant to the plain facts and try to deny them. And that's silly. And you can disagree, obviously, about what choices we should make, what political actions should follow from the fact of climate change. But I think it's silly to argue that it's not a fact and it's outdated. We have the evidence. Well, similarly, with sex differences, you find it flips. There, conservatives, Republicans are much more likely to be aware of the science and not to deny the science about sex differences. And people on the left tend to be very resistant and don't want to admit that, you know, that this is pretty well settled at this point, that sex differences are real. I mentioned in the book that, you know, there are whole journals devoted to studying sex differences in biology because it's incredibly important for medicine, among other things. You have to know that men and women respond differently to different medications, for example, and it's not just based on body size either. It's based on the different biology, the hormones and so on and so forth of men and women. So these things are important, and it's important not to deny them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always frustrated me that, and I'm sure you've heard the old line that reality has a liberal bias, and that drives me nuts because it's not about ideology at all. This is one of the few things that's absolutely bipartisan.
Yes, it is. I mean, we all have our priors, and we look for evidence that supports our pre-existing assumptions, and we tend to discount evidence that challenges it.
No, definitely.
Challenges them.
Yeah. Other thing I wanted to ask you about is this notion, it's taken from the Marxist literature of false consciousness. I think it's really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how that's been used by the feminist movement?
Sure. So this idea of false consciousness, originally a Marxist concept, was the response that Marxists had to the fact that not all of the proletariat were revolutionary. And they attributed this to their false consciousness, that is, that they did not recognize their own best interests, so that they had to be, they had to be taught and led to recognize that they were part of a class and that they needed to eschew the other attachments that they might have in their lives, like to their families or to their countries, and recognize themselves instead as members of a class worldwide, the worldwide workers, right? And women, the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s was very tied in with the New Left and with Marxism. It was very heavily influenced by Marx and Freud, and so they adopted this idea of false consciousness as well. And they decided that the reason that women were not up in arms about their status as an oppressed class was that they too had false consciousness, that they might have thought they were happy and fulfilled, but they just it had to be explained to them. They had to have their consciousness raised. And so there were consciousness raising groups in the 70s where they were also called bitch sessions, where women would sit around and talk about all the things that they were dissatisfied with their husbands and their children and their lives and whatever. And this was a way of encouraging women to see themselves as part of an oppressed class.
Well, it's interesting to me because it seems like, well, from one hand, this is a really fascinating concept, but it's also really frustrating because it's, in a sense, almost unfalsifiable, which I don't know that's very useful in that way. But then it also occurred to me that if feminists are, many modern feminists are making these arguments that, women should be as aggressive as men are in every way, and that work outside of the home is just more fulfilling, is of a higher level than being just a housewife, you could almost say that they're sort of trying to implant their own false consciousness into women.
I couldn't have said it better. You're absolutely right. They had their own view about the proper life of a woman. I quote Simone de Beauvoir, the famous French feminist, who said, among other things, woman, one is not born but is made a woman, for example. That was the sort of the root of the whole cultural construction of gender idea. But yeah, they wanted women to have lives that looked much more like men's lives, and they insisted that it was stultifying to raise children. And honestly, my view is, first of all, they devalued one of the most fulfilling parts of life, in my judgment. I have had a full career and I have had a full family life. And I can testify that as much as I have been so fortunate to have a job and a work that is fulfilling and that's gratifying and so forth, and stimulating and all of that, it can't hold a candle to the joy of raising my three sons. That was the great pleasure of my life. And so to attempt to diminish that side of life and to say, oh, just a housewife and so on, is, first of all, unjust and not true for the way a lot of women feel. We find it a tremendously rewarding part of life, maybe the most rewarding part of life. But the other thing is, of course, that it leaves no room for individual choice. Simone de Beauvoir said that women should not be given the choice of being mothers or full-time mothers or homemakers, for which many women like to do for some period of their lives in any event, not all of it, because we're fortunate to live long lives now, and there's time enough for everything. But she wanted to say that she did say too many women will take this choice if it's offered to them. So no one should have this opportunity or this choice. Talk about trying to limit women's options. I mean, she and other feminists were open about it.
But now it seems to me, at least there's a new, I don't know if it's exactly a third wave, but a different type of feminist that at least I see emerging a little bit. Like, for instance, I think of Sheryl Sandberg, CEO of Facebook, and that argument that women can't have it all, that you don't have to make a choice. I wonder if that isn't sort of fundamentally wrongheaded, or just in a way telling women that, well, if you don't have it all, then there's some failing in you or something like that.
I do think that there's a tremendous amount of pressure on women, and I've seen it with young women in particular who always ask me, how do you do that, professional and family balance? How does one do it? They feel so much pressure to excel in every way and to be the superwoman. And I do think that's kind of a burden for some women. But I also think the old pithy saying is basically right, which is you can have it all, just not all at once. And I think that's pretty accurate for people in first world countries who are fortunate enough. If you get married, that's very critical, because the job of taking care of children does require two. And if you attempt to do it all by yourself, it's impossible. I mean, a woman cannot, I shouldn't say it's impossible. There are plenty of single mothers who do a fine job, but they kill themselves in the process. And that shouldn't be the model either. And in many cases, when women attempt in very many cases, when women attempt to do it all by themselves, the children do suffer. So, but people, the other thing I want to stress is that, so there's all this pressure to have it all, to do it all, blah, blah. And then there's also this sense that it's all about me. It's the list of I wants. I want a fulfilling career and a great husband and, 2.3 children. I want. And I want to have it all. And, I think we'd be better people if we focused a little bit more on service and on the joys of giving to others rather than having, because there's tremendous joy and gratification to be had in being the one who gives. And I think we've gotten away from that to a large degree. I mean, family life does involve sacrifice. It does involve putting others before yourself. And for men and women, by the way. I mean, my husband, for example, worked harder than he would have if he hadn't had a wife and children. And that's typical. You find that married men with kids tend to work harder, longer hours. They tend to be more ambitious than men who aren't married or who are divorced. And it's very interesting. There's something about the responsibility of caring for others that spurs men to excel at work. And but they pay a price. They lose something. There are trade-offs. They lose leisure time. They lose maybe a little peace of mind under the stress of having to bring home the bacon, or the woman if it's the case that the couple reverses the traditional roles, and I know couples who do, where it's the wife who is the main breadwinner and the husband who's the main caretaker, and that's fine too. But in any event, people who focus on giving rather than having, I think, are more likely, actually, ironically, to be happy.
Well, and it seems to me, it occurs to me, and you're saying that's sort of the dark side of the many individualistic revolutions of the 60s and the 70s. And certainly, on the positive side, we saw great gains in equality, not just for women, but for minorities and so forth. But that reverse side of it is, it seems like we've lost that much of that community spirit and that sort of bonding together type of thing. And that I don't know that we have come up with a really good answer to that as a society yet.
I completely, yes, I endorse that. Look, I mean, one of the things that the feminist movement did was, as I say, it joined with the sexual revolution, and it made war on the idea of the nuclear family. I quote Susan Faludi, a famous feminist who wrote a book called Backlash, and she said that that no woman can hear the sound, or no feminist, I can't remember how she put it exactly, but can hear the sound of wedding bells without sadness. Well,
wow,
that's actually not true. Women like to get married; they like the security that marriage affords. But we have moved away from the marriage norm en masse, and sadly, it hasn't affected all levels of American society the same way. Among college-educated people, they still tend to follow the old script of you finish your education, then you get married, and then you have babies in that order, and they tend to stay married, and only about 9% of college-educated women have babies without being married, whereas the rates among high school dropouts and those who have lesser education is extremely high. Over 50% have babies before they're married, and or never marry. And this is contributing to, first of all, a lot of unnecessary human misery on the part of children, but it's also contributing to the widening inequality in our society. It's worrisome because people who are concerned about rising inequality tend to focus so much on factory jobs that are going overseas or other factors. But if you just look at it through the lens of who's married and who isn't, you can see a vast difference. You will see that, for example, people who follow the life script that I just mentioned of getting married, finishing their education, getting married, and getting a job, any job, their chances of living in poverty are infinitesimal. Whereas having a child before getting married is a very good route to a life of poverty. So this is incredibly important.
Well, the response to this, at least from what I've heard on the left, is, okay, that's true. And the solution to this is doing a much better job of providing birth control to poor women, because that's a real issue. Well, what do you think about that response?
Yeah, they've been saying that for decades. Here's another reality that they don't want to grapple with, which is that when single women have babies without husbands, they know all about birth control. They want those babies. They want someone to love and to love them, and they know all about birth control. It's not a lack of birth control. Not only that, birth control is very inexpensive. Condoms are cheap. Lots of methods of birth control are cheap. But what you find when you look at people who've had children out of wedlock is that they did it knowingly, or with, let us say, a certain casualness about birth control because they weren't too sour on the idea of actually becoming pregnant. So there's, that's something to grapple with. And, people who have had difficult childhoods themselves and didn't get enough love sometimes think that the solution is to have a baby of their own, but it's not a good solution.
So in a way, it sounds like this is a lot of people are proposing a technological solution to a cultural problem.
Exactly.
Yeah, which
exactly
isn't going to work out.
And we've made birth control and birth control widely available. We've made sex education universal, and it hasn't had the effect that the left claimed for it.
Well, in the book also, I wanted to mention, this really surprised me. I always thought that the sexual revolution of the 60s was driven by, more than anything else, by the birth control pill, which came out in 1960. But there's a part of your book where you make to me, a fairly convincing argument that the importance of the pill in all of this has actually been overstated. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. There were I'm not downplaying the importance of technology in affecting culture. So, for example, I do mention that the invention of, or the wide availability of, the automobile arguably spurred our first sexual revolution in America that happened in the teens and 1920s, because young people could meet in a closed car and be out of the view of chaperones or parents or anyone else. So there was a little mini sexual revolution in the 1920s that arguably was affected by that technological change. But there were other things going on in society as well. And I point out that you can see the changes in sexual behavior, at least based on unwed births and other indexes, that predated the arrival of the birth control pill. And by the way, when the birth control pill arrived, for a while after its introduction, it was expensive. It was hard to get without a doctor's. You needed a doctor's prescription, and many doctors would not prescribe it for women who weren't married. So it was actually not widely used for some time after its introduction. There were other methods of birth control that were more widely used, but it was really a change in mores that propelled the search for contraception, rather, I think, than the other way around.
Right. You've mentioned divorce a couple of times. I wanted to ask you about that because, of course, since really, I guess, the early 70s, we've seen a major change in divorce law in the United States, the rise of no-fault divorces particularly. And the typical feminist response is, well, this is a really good thing because there were so many women who were in, abusive, oppressive marriages that were almost like, in a way, domestic prison sentences. And this gave them the opportunity to get out of these horrible situations. How do you, is there something to that? What do you think about that?
I do think there's something to it. But I also would stress that there are no, as the economists teach us, there are no choices, only trade-offs. So while it's true that easier divorce freed some percentage of unhappy women from very destructive marriages, made it easier to escape, it also weakened the bonds of a lot of marriages that were not so unhappy. And I cite the data in the book about the fact that a significant percentage of divorces happen in relationships where there is no, severe conflict, but simply people saying, well, they think they might be happier, or they meet someone new, or they fall in love with someone else, etc. And I cite data showing that when you compare couples who divorce, unhappy couples who divorced, with unhappy couples who decided to stay together and work on their problems, the unhappy couples who divorced were less happy 5 years later than the unhappy couples who decided to stay and work it out. And I think there's been the divorce has actually been extremely destructive for children and for adults. It's way too common. Obviously, it should be an option for people who are in abusive or really destructive relationships, and especially where there are no children involved. But the widespread, let's say, acceptance of divorce or destigmatizing of divorce has had some bad consequences as well as some good ones.
I also wanted to ask you, and you mentioned this again a few times, abortion, which obviously has to play a major role in any book about modern feminism. And my sense of what sort of the modern feminist position is, so to speak, is that it's kind of a my body, my choice. And it seems to me at least most mainstream feminists would say that abortion should be, as the phrase goes, safe, legal, and rare. And okay, I'm a man, and so I feel really uncomfortable telling women what they can do with their bodies. And those two slogans to me make a lot of sense. I find myself agreeing with them, and I was wondering what you think about those slogans or positions or whatever you want to call them.
Well, the safe, legal, and rare wording actually came from Bill Clinton when he was triangulating and trying to put himself sort
Right.
of to the right of his party, which had become, full-on abortion rights party. And so when he said rare, that was pretty conservative for a Democrat,
Mm-hmm.
to even suggest that abortion should be rare or shouldn't be a commonplace. But I don't find that most feminists use that word rare. I think they tend to view it as a positive good, to quote John C. Calhoun on the subject of slavery. They don't say rare. They just say it's my body, my choice. And one thing that I do find troublesome is that among many other things, is that they always stress that it's such a difficult decision. It's a difficult decision, but women should be the ones to make it. Well, first of all, if it's not a human being that you are terminating, if it's just a clump of cells, then why is it such a difficult decision? And furthermore, women are, except for those women who are raped, which are fewer than 1% of abortions yearly, women already have a choice. They have a choice to prevent pregnancy if they're not ready to be mothers. And properly used, birth control is almost 100% effective. And so I find that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just wondering. I guess maybe I've just led too much of a sheltered life here, but is it the case that there are a significant number of feminists who have no problem with abortion as abortion as essentially a form of birth control? I'm not talking about morning after pills or anything like that, but fairly long on that's a fairly uncontroversial position, because that just really kind of blows my mind a little bit, I guess.
Well, look, here's what they would say. They would say, obviously, nobody wants to go through an abortion. It's a surgical procedure. It's not exactly pleasant for the woman who's undergoing it. It's physically painful, and there's a lot of bleeding involved and cramping, and then there's the emotional toll that it takes, because every woman who has an abortion pretty much is aware that this is her child, and so when you go from being pregnant to unpregnant, you may feel a sense of relief, but there's also some grief and sense of loss that goes along with it, even, I think, among the most pro-choice women. So they would say nobody wants to go through an abortion, but they would say birth control fails, people are raped, and so it has to be the backup. But that would be how they would phrase it. But when they do things like say, shout your abortion, or keep your rosaries off my ovaries,
Right.
or other things that you've seen at the women's marches and so forth, you do get a sense that they have this kind of callous attitude toward what abortion is. I see that a lot.
And I would guess they would argue in response to that they're trying to sort of destigmatize it, which is different from actually encouraging it as a positive good, as some, certainly some might argue that, and that because women, right, they're under so much pressure and strain.
No, I think so. I think they would probably phrase it that way. But in the process of doing that, in the process of destigmatizing it, they've wound up tying themselves in knots. They have wound up taking positions that are so dishonest for example, there was a big debate in the 1990s about partial birth abortion. And the feminists were so dishonest. I mean, first they claimed when pro-life forces began to elevate this topic and say that it should be outlawed, the practice of partial birth abortion, which involves usually second and third trimester fetuses, and it involves dilating the cervix with special drugs over a course of about 3 days. And then the woman is brought into the abortion clinic, and the baby is delivered by a breech delivery up to the head. While the head is still in the womb, the doctor takes a scissors and makes a hole in the baby's skull, and then attaches a hose and suctions out the baby's brain, and then pulls the rest of the head out of the birth canal. And this is a horrifying procedure. So when efforts were made to ban it as being too close to infanticide, first the feminists said there was no such thing. There was no such thing as this procedure. Well, then, it transpired that there was indeed such a procedure. So that was not true. So then they said, well, the baby is already dead by the time it's delivered because of the anesthesia that is administered to the mother. Well, that turned out to be another lie. In point of fact, the American College of Anesthesiologists issued statements saying, no, that's not true. Administering anesthesia to a pregnant woman does not kill the fetus, because there are all these women who were scheduled to have other kinds of, pregnant women who were scheduled to have other kinds of surgeries who were panicked at the thought that
Right.
the anesthesia would kill their unborn child. So the anesthesiologist said, no, that's not true. Okay, so they backed off that one. And then they began it's incredibly rare argument. And again, that wasn't true either. So, they do not grapple with the reality of what's happening here, and they try to mislead the public about the nature of abortion and what happens and about the facts. And I think that's regrettable, let's say.
Before we move off of abortion, I wanted to ask you, I said at one point, as a man, I feel uncomfortable about holding forth on this. And of course, that's another thing sometimes you'll hear from some, I guess, modern feminists that, well, all these laws are passed by men, and men really don't have, in a sense, a right to hold forth and make these decisions for women. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, there are pro-choice men, just like there are pro-life men, and the male-female difference is not the significant one here. It's a difference of philosophy. There are lots and lots of women are pro-life as well as pro-choice. It's not that's not the way the argument cuts. It doesn't cut by sex. It cuts by philosophy and whether you think that it's the taking of a human life that is immoral or not. And so it really shouldn't matter what your sex is. It's how you view this particular issue. I'm highly aware that, that's not the right way to put it, but I used to stress when I was discussing this issue in my syndicated column that I was pro-woman from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death. So think of it that way.
I like that formulation. In Sex Matters, you also write about what you call the campus rape industrial complex. And I'm sure of course it's often said that 1 in 5 women on college campuses have experienced some form of sexual assault. And if that's correct, that suggests to me that we have a huge problem and that it does require kind of a industrial complex to deal with. But you sort of take issue with this in the book, correct?
Absolutely. I note that there's a lot of really bad behavior going on college campuses. I am arguing for a return to a much saner and more humane way of men and women meeting, dating, and forming relationships in college and in life. than we currently have. I think the hookup culture is demeaning and dehumanizing and just terrible. But that said, and even acknowledging that there's a lot of bad behavior that goes on, it is completely wrong to say that 1 in 5 women suffer sexual assault. That requires torturing the data to the point where a grope or or an unwanted kiss counts as sexual assault. And I just don't think of it that way. And I think most people, when you say sexual assault, they think rape, right? But that's not what these data are. That's not the way these data are compiled. When you look at the studies upon which that 1 in 5 statistic arises, you find that those are the kinds of things that have to get classified as sexual assault in order to arrive at that 1 in 5 figure. So it's highly misleading.
So you mentioned the hookup culture. Now that to me just seems so incredibly bizarre. I mean, I came of age well before that, and it just seems like such an awful, dehumanizing sort of thing to go through. And I'm so glad that I grew up before that actually was a thing.
I agree, and I think the kids agree. They know something's badly wrong, and some of them are really perspicacious and understand exactly what went wrong, and are trying to return to a more sensitive and humane kind of society. There are students against students against pornography at Yale or something like that who objected to Sex Week at Yale, which is quite typical. You find it at a lot of colleges, and there are some students who are rebelling and saying, "Look, this is not a good way to behave. This is not a good ethic to encourage. It creates misunderstandings. People get their feelings hurt, sometimes much worse." Look, the hookup culture is something that could have been designed by horny 13-year-old boys. And they would have thought, great. You mean you go to a party and everybody gets drunk, especially the women, and then you pair off and go to your dorm room and get it on? That's terrific. Well, of course, for women, it's not so terrific. And the women are the ones overwhelmingly who complain about sexual assault. And by the way, the overwhelming majority of sexual assaults happen as a consequence of that, not as a consequence, but when large amounts of liquor are consumed. So this social pattern of getting very drunk and then pairing off with people you hardly know or don't even know is a perfect laboratory experiment for how to create the environment for very, very bad sex and for sexual assault.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's of a piece with the pornification of culture as well. I mean, when I was growing up, porn was available in, adult bookstores, these seedy places that were located in bad parts of town and all that. But now it's just everywhere. And I mean, it seems like it's just so degrading. I mean, there's more and more research coming out about how the awful effects on loving relationships and so forth. And just seems like a truly awful thing.
It is, and it's, I considered putting a chapter in my book about it, but the topic is so disgusting that I actually couldn't bring myself to do it. But it really is a poison that has infected our culture, and I think we have to get serious about curbing it somehow. It is. It does destroy many relationships. It coarsens our sensibilities. It gives men the wrong ideas about what women want and are like, and it's utterly dehumanizing. It reduces people to body parts. When love is the great glue that holds men and women together, and pornography is the great antagonist of love.
Well, and I think a lot of people who are lucky enough not to have any extensive experience or know what's going on in that world, when you say degrading, I mean, so much of what's considered mainstream in pornography is just horrific, at least as far as I'm concerned, especially to women. And just when I think about young men being raised on a steady diet of that what that must do to their brains is just it really shocks and startles and disgusts me.
Me too. And, there was a movement among certain feminists there was a big anti-porn crusade that for a while there looked like it might link feminists with conservative Christians to battle the scourge of pornography. But a lot of other feminists took the view that they were kind of free speech absolutists, and they did not want to join with certainly with conservative Christians, and felt that the anti-porn feminists were being co-opted, and so that was a big battle that happened in the 70s and 80s. But I'm sympathetic to efforts to curb porn, whatever province they come from.
Yeah, well, and there are some, of course, there are some feminists who make this kind of pro-porn female empowerment type of argument. To me, that is so divorced from the reality of what pornography is that it's just ridiculous. Actually,
I agree. Yep.
I want to ask you a little bit about gender identity too, because it seems to me that's become maybe the most recent kind of cultural battleground here. And so here's my understanding of it, that gender isn't a choice of these two boxes, male or female. There's sort of a continuum, if you will. And I guess until fairly recently, people who didn't identify entirely as male or female, they were basically forced into one of these two boxes. And to me, once I accept that, it follows that accepting, really even embracing more fluid gender identities is a good, rational, scientific type of thing. But when you talk about it in this book, though, you argue that society has been, the word used is reckless in accepting these gender differences. And I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit.
Yes. Well, what I think is, so you said we're beginning to learn that gender fluidity is a real thing, and that there aren't two sexes, there are many sexes or many sexual identities. This is all speculative. There's no evidence for this yet. Now, it may be true, but it may not be. It's guess. It's a guesswork. I find, look, if adults want to change their bodies or their behavior and dress or act or get surgery and hormone injections and so forth to change their perceived sexual identity. I would say, by the way, that a man cannot become a woman and vice versa. But that's because, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation, every single cell of our bodies is sexualized to some degree. And so I don't think it's possible to change your sex. But it is certainly possible to make yourself into a passable image of the other sex through surgery and hormones. And look, I'm for freedom. I think that if adults want to do that, if they think it will make them happy, they are certainly free to do with their bodies and their lives what they wish. What worries me is the trend to do this to children, because we are in totally uncharted territory here. We have no idea whether trans identities are a real thing or just something that has been imagined. And we have no idea, and children are not in a position to make life-altering decisions for themselves of the most dramatic kind that include inevitably sterility, because when you change from one sex to the other, you become sterile, and drastic surgery and drastic psychological effects of taking these hormone suppressing medications that is now considered normal in certain circles. I'm worried about this because we don't have any sense that of wait a minute, slow down. Children go through stages, and I talk in the book about how when I was a little girl, I was a bit of a tomboy. And I had two older brothers, And all the toys that we played with in our house tended to be boy toys, trucks and, all of that sort of thing. And I liked playing with all those toys, probably because those were the available toys. And also I liked to climb trees and play outside and get dirty and all that. And so, and I wanted all of my friends to call me Timmy. I wanted to be a boy. And I shudder to think what would have happened. I mean, it was a stage. I went through it. I came out the other end. I'm very happy being female. I shudder to think what would have happened to a little girl like me today. Would the parents be told, look, you've got to ratify her desire to be a boy. You can do severe psychological damage to her if you deny that she's a boy. She needs to start getting hormone suppressing shots so that she won't go through puberty. I think this is really dangerous and crazy. Kids they go through stages. They don't know themselves yet. The experience that we've had with kids who have gender identity or disorder or gender dysphoria, they keep changing what they call it in the psychological literature. But the evidence is there that the overwhelming majority of children who express these feelings outgrow them, especially after they go through puberty. But if we're now going to be giving these kids hormone suppression and not allowing them to go through natural puberty, this is playing with human lives in a way that I regard as highly irresponsible.
Well, and again, it seems like part of a larger cultural trend that we've become much less of a culture of restraint and caution and much more of a kind of, if it feels right, do it and do it right away, basically.
And it's this empire of feelings. Feelings are important, of course, in our lives, but we cannot let them reign. We have to use our rational brains too. And, because you may feel a certain way doesn't make it more authentic than what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're running a little short on time. I have one final question for you. It seems to me that this is, at least I feel this is very much a man's world still. I think men have it much easier than men, especially men who are, reasonably well off, educated, white males like me, for example. And so I'm wondering, how do we acknowledge that we still need to do some work on gender issues, inequality issues, without falling into what you see as these errors of modern feminism? I mean, what's the way forward, do you think?
Well, I think we need to have a much greater focus on manners and on teaching men what it means to be a good man. I cite in the book the word, I'm Jewish, and I cite in the book the Yiddish word mensch. Mm-hmm. Mensch literally means man. But it doesn't mean that in the Jewish tradition. It means someone who is upright, honest, responsible. When you say he's a real mensch, you mean he's a generous, well-balanced, good person. And that's what we need to strive for both sexes. And we need to recognize that men don't profit at the expense of women, and women don't profit at the expense of men. We thrive best when we serve one another. And we're happiest when we are respectful of one another. One of the really terrible consequences of the feminist fury toward men is that there's been a backlash against women on the part of men, which you see in, the form of the manosphere online, where men, some angry young men apparently go to these websites that encourage them to be cruel and heartless toward women on the grounds that women like that better, and so on and so forth. And so we need a great deal of relearning of what it means to respect one another completely, and with all of our differences.
Amen. Of course, it's a big job, but I absolutely agree with that. And with that, we will close. Mona Charen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, before you go, I've got a weird political fact of the week for you. But real quick, before I get to that, I want to thank everyone who's subscribed to the show so far. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you will. It really does help. Also, last week we got our first iTunes review. Now, it looks kind of lonely there all by itself, so if you could add your own to go along with it, that would be great. That way, when someone comes across the show on iTunes, they'll be able to see what other people think. And also, Apple's ways are very mysterious, but we're fairly certain that reviews are very helpful in getting the word out, getting the show promoted to more iTunes type folks. Another thing that helps out a lot is sharing the show. So if you know of anyone you think might enjoy it, I hope you'll let them know about it. If you could post about the show on social media and so on, that would be great. I would really appreciate it. And hey, if you've got a question, comment, future guest suggestion, or anything else, you can reach me at mike@politicsplus.us. And of course, the show's website, it's politicsplus.us. Okay, now for my weird political fact of the week. James Madison, father of the Constitution and fourth U.S. president, he was, of course, a huge intellect, but he was also a very tiny guy. He's the smallest U.S. president, standing only 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing, by most estimates, only around 100 pounds. Wow. There you go. Anyway, I'll be back with a new interview next week. I hope you'll join me.